What is striking to me about the Trump approach, including what he says about DEI and so forth, is literally how many times more 17-year-old Black men are attracted to it than are attracted to the version that attracted you.
I mean, you know, I'm offering up gold lame tennis shoes because you think that young Black men are into sneakers. We're gonna protect your right to smoke menthol cigarettes. Like, that's a thing. I mean, the stereotyping and the sort of.
I'm sorry, just to jump in. That's not the Trump pitch. In fact, Kamala Harris
was very much the Trump pitch.
No, Kamala Harris put out a 5-point agenda for opportunity agenda for young Black men, of which one of the 5 items was Bitcoin and one of the 5 items was marijuana legalization. So yeah, I've seen what that looks like, and that's not what the Trump appeal was.
But that's because, you know what the marijuana piece was? Because Black entrepreneurs, the young Black men who went to jail because of marijuana laws, now have the opportunity to benefit from actually being entrepreneurial in that space. That's what that was about. It wasn't playing that Black people like to smoke marijuana. It's like, guess what? The thing that you went to jail for, you now can begin to build a dream around because white kids are already doing it. That's what that was about. Hey, folks, I'm excited about the conversation this week with my guest, Oren Cass. It opened up some really interesting moments for me, and I hope it does for you as well. Oren is the executive director of American Compass and author of The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America. He is a contributing opinion writer for the Financial Times, and his work also appears regularly in publications, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's the editor of a new book that's coming out on June 3rd, The New Conservatives, Restoring America's Commitment to Family, Community, and Industry. And trust me, when we unpack that bad boy, it got real fast. I think you'll like this one. Stay tuned. Coming up next with Oren Cass right here on the Michael Steele Podcast right after this. Hey, folks, welcome to the Michael Steele Podcast. So glad you guys are taking a moment with an adult beverage to join us in a conversation. You notice I presume the adult beverage because that's the only way we can get through the day. I'm excited to have this gentleman on with us. I watched him recently on The Daily Show, and Oren just laid out so much that made sense for me in terms of kind of putting in the context where things are and how much of the crazy may not be so crazy at times, and how much of the stuff that is crazy is actually crazy. So I'm really excited to have you, Oren. Welcome, man. I really appreciate you taking time to be here.
No, my pleasure. It's great to see you.
So you guys, you're working with and actually will be releasing in June, I guess an anthology of the moment. It's The New Conservatives, Restoring America's Commitment to Family, Community, and Industry, coming out on June 3rd. You're the editor on that, but you've also got some pieces there. Talk about what this new conservative thing is. Is it a person? Is it a place? Is it a thing? Because as a conservative, I need to know, because I just need to know where I put my hat, because I'm in a weird space, man. I'll just tell you straight up, because Democrats see me as a moderate and conservatives see me as a traitor. So I tell those SOBs, they can check their ish, because they've never walked my walk as a Republican, and who definitionally identifies with some fundamentally conservative principles and ideas, which is not what MAGA is. I don't see MAGA as conservative. I see it largely as an infection, a distortion. But you helped me, because I watched you go toe to toe with Jon Stewart, and appreciated how you kind of leveled up the case. So I want you to do that now, if you could, particularly in the context of what you guys are releasing on June 3rd.
Sure, and I'm very curious to see which parts of it you do or don't agree with. Also, I think that a terrible habit of conservatives is to spend all our time debating what a conservative is. But
Well, you've already hit a home run, baby, because that is
it's
so true.
it's an important question. And, this book, The New Conservatives, is an anthology for the 5th anniversary of American Compass, which is the organization I founded back in 2020. Very much focused just on this idea that obviously, certainly the Republican Party was changing. Some of that is just a result of Donald Trump himself and his role, but I think in some senses, Trump is a symptom of some much broader shifts that we're seeing in how certainly conservatives think about the world. How people who prefer limited government, prefer free markets, also are starting to realize some of the shortcomings in in some of those things. And so, the work that we were doing and continue to do is to try to really get back to what I would argue are the core conservative principles. And that's where you see in the subtitle of the book, emphasizing family, community, and industry, thinking about, what are the actual ends that we care about? What does human flourishing mean? And what is the kind of markets, what is the kind of government role that's going to deliver that? And so, the work that we've done is, first of all, try to diagnose a little bit what's gone wrong. I think for a long time, the Republican Party sort of tried to argue everything is great, and you can tell everything's great because GDP is going up, right? Or you can tell everything is great because even more so just because the stock market is going up. And if you're, complaining or you're concerned or you're saying workers are falling behind, well, then you just must not love freedom enough somehow.
Right.
And I think what the most fundamental thing that has changed is people are like, that's actually not right. In fact, there was a lot going wrong in this country over the past few decades that was not being experienced by the elite, that was not being experienced by people with high levels of education, people who were working in knowledge industries, who were seeing all the benefits of prosperity. But for most people, in fact, the ability to make ends meet, to raise a family and give them middle-class security, I think really was becoming harder. And recognizing the ways that could happen in a market. How could it be that the stock market is going up, that profits are up, GDP is up, and yet so many things are down? I think it took conservatives a while to wrap our heads around that. And so one part for us is recognizing, look, capitalism is the best possible system, certainly anyone's ever thought of, for generating prosperity, but it doesn't do it automatically. If you have free trade with China so that the highest profits come from offshoring to China, there's no reason to believe that's going to be good for workers. If you have what we call financialization, where Wall Street doesn't invest in the real economy, it spins piles of assets around in speculative circles, the hedge funds can make a lot of money doing that. There's no reason to believe that's going to be good for a working family. And so the core of our critique is that we've really lost touch a little bit with what it takes for capitalism to work. And therefore that what we as conservatives are called upon to do is to think about those problems and think about the role that government and policy has to play in addressing them. And so I think, there are some real connections with the things the Trump administration is doing. There are some things that we really focus on that you don't see as much in the Trump administration, but we take a very long run view of where does conservatism need to go, both to be successful as a political movement and then to also strengthen the country.
Okay, so help me understand where the connection is with some of the things that the Trump administration is doing that are working.
Well, a few areas I would emphasize right off the bat. One is this trade agenda, and we can come back to the specifics of it. I've been very critical of some of the details of the implementation, but I think directionally, the recognition that globalization has not worked well, certainly free trade with China has not worked well, and that a healthy economic.
Can I just
go ahead.
Jump in right there? Is that because we made what I think was a profound mistake of inviting China into the WTO when that was just not smart, given how China is and has been as not a reliable partner, but one that lies, cheats, and steals? in the process. So why the hell would you even bring them in the WTO? A lot of conservatives, right? Why are we doing this? You know, so would that be a piece of that? And so this is a correction, if you will, in confronting that lie that, oh yeah, they're just like the rest of the free enterprise market system. No, they're not.
That's definitely a big piece of it. And if you had to pick one mistake, I think that would be the top mistake on the list when it comes to trade and globalization. One of the really interesting things that I think is happening within conservatism, though, is to dig into that and say, well, wait a minute, why was a mistake, right? Because a lot of the case for it was, well, if China will make stuff more cheaply, then that's good for us. We get cheaper stuff. And if you say, okay, but they're, lying and cheating and they're subsidizing their producers and they're manipulating their currency, a lot of economists, even today, a lot of economists on the right of center will say, what are you complaining about? The point of the economy is to get as much cheap stuff. If other countries want to do that and send it to us, what could be wrong?
Right.
And so it's important, I think, to get, a place where Trump was obviously very influential was all the way back in 2015, 2016, saying, hey, there's a problem here. And, by the way, I worked for, then Governor Romney in 2012. He actually, much to the chagrin of the Wall Street Journal, in 2012 started saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a problem here. And the initial reaction from the overwhelming majority of conservatives was, you're crazy. Free trade is good because it's efficient and gets us cheap stuff. And so I think what you're seeing is that, China has sort of been the on-ramp to conservatives really focusing on this, or more crassly, maybe the gateway drug, to like saying, wait a minute, there's something wrong with our theory here. But then when you actually dig into it and you realize, okay, what did we get wrong? I think the fundamental thing we got wrong is just ignoring the fact that making things matters. The view of the economists was making things doesn't matter. There's nothing special about an industrial economy, about manufacturing. If you do lose those jobs, that's fine. You'll get other better jobs instead. And what we're seeing is that's just not true on any level. You don't get other better jobs instead. Your whole economy really suffers. You're less innovative, you're less productive when you're not doing manufacturing. And certainly your national security and your resilience suffers if you're entirely dependent on foreign supply chains. And so China is issue number one in those areas. But if you take those issues seriously, then you also start to realize, well, wait a minute, in a lot of ways, Japan has done the same thing. Japan pursues a lot of policies to prop up its producers and sell stuff into our market, which if all we care about is the stuff, that's great. But if we care about our own productive capacity, it's a problem. Korea does the same thing. Taiwan does the same thing. Germany does the same thing. And so what I think you see the Trump administration doing now, and it's really interesting, you look at on day one, they put out this memorandum on America First trade policy. And the key focus, China isn't the top line. China is part of it, but the key focus is balance. That if you want to have a trading system that actually works, that the economic models actually pencil out, and you can say this is good for America, trade can be great. We should want to have high levels of trade, but we should want it to be balanced trade. We should want it to be other people making things that we want in return for us making things that other people want. And so that, again, if you only care about consumers, that's a kind of silly thing to focus on. If you care about workers, it actually matters a lot. And so that's one place that I think is really important.
No, and you have expressed it better and clearer than the Trump administration has, quite honestly, because largely they just come out of the room with a sledgehammer or a chainsaw, and just gone at it and not really kind of contextualize, what the top line is. But even having expressed it as clearly as you had, there are some presumptions there, I think, about what we think the marketplace is or what the marketplace should be. And the marketplace does not include the workers, because we gave up on manufacturing a long time ago. We offshored our manufacturing capacity. Therefore, we did not intellectualize manufacturing, meaning keep it in our school system so that we can educate and train the next level of workforce that could actually build the damn widget. right? We decided we liked the fact that we could get the widget for 97 cents from China. And as I've said to everybody at every place and every venue I've been, pick up anything in your damn house and look and see where it's made from, and it ain't here. It's China. And we are happy with that. We very easily, Oren, transitioned into a consumer capacity or consumer mindset. Even the worker became the consumer and was less interested in working in that capacity, because generationally, outside of the coal mines of West Virginia, we weren't thinking about who was going to build the TV screen I'm watching this show on, or the mug that that I manufacture the mug I have in my hand. So where is the transition to that? Because I don't see it, because you're not going to get that if you eliminate the Department of Education. You're just not, because states are going to sit there and go, dude, I don't have time to do remedial training for skills, right? Because I'm weighing, math, science, and tech against the guy who's going to build the microphone. So where do conservatives find that nesting space where you say, because let me just one last point on this. When I was lieutenant governor, I very much emphasized the very thing I'm talking about, that I thought were essential to reimagining this space, recognizing not everyone's going to college, right? Someone's got to build the desk, right? And how do we begin to train that new workforce to emerge, while we also do the stuff on tech and math and science? So how do conservatives now look at that? Because it's not just one thing you beat your breast and say, "Oh, I'm for the worker," but then you're deconstructing the very tools that those workers are going to need to access this marketplace, knowing that right now we are much more of a consumption mind than we are of a manufacturing mind. And what are we manufacturing again? Because we're not building cars in America the way we used to in the 1950s. Sorry, we're just not. No manufacturer of any vehicle is going to have every form of production in their one shop. But tell me if I'm wrong, Oren, I don't know.
Well, I agree with most of that. I think the one place I would maybe adjust it a little bit is that I think actually the American people, for the most part, still care about this stuff a lot.
Mm-hmm.
When we do a lot of survey research, we do focus groups, and whatever we do, we always find that the commitment of the typical family to these ideas, to being interested in the trades and these kinds of jobs, to caring that we do make things in this country, to wanting more of a focus on production and not just consumption, that's a very widely held view. It's been lost from the political class.
Right.
And I think one reason that President Trump has been so effective is that, at least I think we can probably agree rhetorically, he delivers that message in a way that other politicians weren't. At least in framing the problem, he really focused on these things as a problem in a time when pretty much everybody else in both parties was saying there's no problem here. We have more stuff than ever.
Right.
And so I think that's really important as a starting point. Where I agree with you entirely is that addressing this is a much broader challenge. And I think the things that the administration is trying to do on trade is absolutely a piece of it. I don't think you can solve this problem if you just stick with the kind of globalization, we don't care where things are made. But to be successful, you're absolutely right. So education policy is a great example of an area that we talk about a lot at American Compass, in the book, The New Conservatives, exactly along the lines you just described. How do we shift to an education system that, first of all, recognizes and rewards a much wider range of pathways instead of just college?
Right.
And how do we also, from a market perspective, recognize that employers have to be engaged in that this idea of like, well, it's just a free market, so if employers need workers to learn something, the employers will just train them, is just not realistic. That there actually has to be some partnership between the employers and the business sector on one hand, and the education system on the other. And by the way, that labor unions are probably going to have to play an important role in that also. That's one thing that organized labor can be really valuable in.
Yep.
And so I think this is a great example of a place where, you're absolutely right that you don't see this in the Trump administration agenda right now. But if you zoom out a little bit more broadly and look at the conservative movement generally, and a lot of conservative leaders, I do think you see that shifting. And so just to give you one example, a particular policy idea that we've worked on a lot to create what we call a workforce training grant, which is basically to say, how do we provide the same sort of support to a trainee going into the workforce that we provide to a student hanging out on a campus? It was two Republican senators, Tom Cotton and at the time Senator J.D. Vance, who co-sponsored that legislation with a number of House co-sponsors as well. Obviously, Senator Vance has moved on to a new role, but he's certainly someone who I think really focuses on this a great deal. I think someone like then Senator, now Secretary of State Rubio, gives this a lot of attention. And so I think if we look a little bit longer term, I think this is exactly where conservatives are going and need to be going. But totally agree with you that if we want this to work, we need to see that in the policy, and we need to see that alongside some of the trade stuff.
One other piece of the trade discussion, because this is such an anchor moment, I think, for conservatives when you're looking at now coming around into the space where we suddenly support tariffs. Just look, next year will be 50 years a Republican for me. And at no time in those 50 years did I once hear Republican leaders or myself advocate for, tariffs, my favorite word, is beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. Never once. But now that seems to be where we're going. And that seems antithetical to everything that we think builds into the free market. Not that that's not a piece of it. Yes, when you're dealing with a bad actor like China, okay, that's a stick you want to beat them upside the head with. Canada? Seriously? Mexico? You're kidding, right? So there's that piece. You noted at the time where Trump announced the Liberation Day thing for that week, in his tariffs announcement, you sort of you compared it to D-Day, and the only thing that I took away from that comparison was all the bodies on the beach, because at the end of the day, it didn't really kind of work out, because 24 hours, 48 hours later, Trump was doing the backpedal on that. Where does that leave conservatives on this issue, in the face of the market saying, oh, hell no, we are not playing this game, and no, we're not doing it to the degree that you want, the bond market specifically responding negatively to D-Day? How should conservatives be looking like? Do you just sort of forge ahead? Do we have another meeting and come to a different conclusion? What are we doing here?
Well, I think what you see with Liberation Day and what's changed since then, it was, I guess, probably about a week afterward that the administration announced they were pausing the tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs that were the ones kind of aimed at countries that, for the most part, I think we want to have as allies, but that sort of are currently engaged in a trading relationship that really is very imbalanced. And so I think what you see there is a very useful course correction, which is to say, we do need to negotiate with these countries. We do need to ask them to be approaching their own trade policy differently than they have been. But it serves nobody to impose the tariffs on day one before the negotiation can even start. You do have to have some credibility that we are willing to move, that the United States is not going to stick to this old model anymore. But ideally, you want to create the space for those negotiations to proceed. And so I think, that's what we see happening right now. I do want to pick up on the point, though, about the sort of the 50-year window in two respects. One, it's important to say that, your choice of 50 years or it happens to be your reality of 50 years is a really striking, therefore, starting point of like 1975, because in the early 1970s, of course, Richard Nixon did impose a 10% global tariff.
He did.
Precisely as a negotiating tool because he wanted to rebalance global trade. And so that was, that was Nixon. Eisenhower has a wonderful passage in his memoir talking about the kind of free trade that Republicans were advancing in the 1950s after World War II that was still very much contingent on all the ways he was going to make sure this did not harm American workers, this did not lead to hollowing out domestically. So it was a much more limited case then. And if you go back before then, of course, Republicans were always the party of tariffs.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln was a tariff man, McKinley, Roosevelt. And so there's a strange way in which what we've come to accept as the sort of, obvious conservative orthodoxy is actually a quite narrow moment in time. And it's really only post-Cold War. And that's
folks who can't see, I'm smiling at what Oren is saying and pointing my finger at him because he's just opened up a door for me, which we'll get into. But you're singing off a song sheet that I feel like I'm the only one on right now. But keep talking, brother. Keep talking.
So look, and the reason, I sort of skipped a gap there from 1975 to post-Cold War because the really interesting question is, what was Reagan? We think of Reagan as the free trader. Right. Reagan was not. When Reagan left office, the Libertarian Cato Institute called him the worst protectionist since Herbert Hoover. And particularly vis-a-vis Japan in that era, right, Reagan was incredibly aggressive. And I think the best example that really mirrors what I see the Trump administration doing now was what happened with Japan and the Japanese automakers. Mm-hmm. Because, Reagan comes into office right as the flood of cheap Japanese vehicles is starting to, really threaten the solvency of the big three. And Reagan negotiated with the Japanese what was called a voluntary export restraint.
Sure did. Yep.
And what's so interesting, right, they threatened a tariff. Japan was worried that Congress was going to impose a tariff. And to avoid that, Japan itself said, we will allow no more growth in vehicle exports to the United States. Instead, Honda and Toyota, you have to go set up shop in the US. And that is, the entire auto industry we now have in the American South, hundreds of thousands of jobs, tens of billions of dollars in investment, is a result of the US using a tariff threat to demand of an ally a rebalancing of trade. And this is exactly what the Trump administration is trying to do. And so I think, again, there's plenty of room to criticize specifics and point out how things can be done better. But conceptually, not only do I think this is a good idea, there's a very good track record of this approach. And it is, in fact, Reagan's own approach.
So we're going to take a quick break. I knew I would enjoy talking with Oren, which is why I immediately pounced on getting him on the podcast. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to get back into a broader question as we look not just at the economic piece, but a lot of the other things that are defining conservatism, in quotation marks, in this era with Oren Cass right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the Michael Steele podcast. Great conversation with Oren Cass. He is the executive director of American Compass and author of The Once and Future Worker, a vision for the renewal of work in America. Will be coming out with a new work this June 3rd, The New Conservatives, Restoring America's Commitment to Family, Community, and Industry. Before we went to break, we were talking about and spent the better part of the first moments together talking about tariffs and the economy and all of that, the economic narrative that conservatives are now reframing. And at the end there, Oren, which got me excited because you were talking about and really kind of pointing out historically in the timeline of the Republican Party, basically where we have been the party of tariffs. And this idea that, well, maybe that's, the whole thing about Republicans and free markets and the narratives kind of built up around that is kind of the exception. The through line is basically what Trump is laying up. And what got me excited about that is I did a piece a couple of months ago on MSNBC Daily, but from a foreign policy standpoint, talking about the role the party has played historically in advancing these storylines around NATO and our relationship with our allies and everything like that. And suddenly now we seem to be kind of dancing on the pinhead of Putin and aligning ourselves more with Russia. And I kind of looked at that historically and tied it into some things culturally and as well as politically, and came to the conclusion that maybe this version of Republicans / conservatives is not the exception, that Trump is not the exception. Trump, in fact, is aligned with more of who we are and have always been. You just made that point for me from the tariff perspective. When you go back and you pinpoint, you went in, and yeah, Reagan at the end of the day was actually a protectionist. He wasn't as much as a free trader as you think. And while he may not have thrown down the tariff gauntlet the way we've seen Trump do it, he did use it to extract something from a partner. So maybe Canada is not that strange in terms of our going to a partner and going, hey, you got to play, right? You're going to have to pay to play. What's your thinking there when you're looking at some of the other aspects of where this conservative republicanism, because I've always kept the two separate, which is why I call myself a Lincoln Republican, because a Lincoln Republican is going to have a little bit more fluidity to it. As you noted, Lincoln did things that, when you stop and think about it today, in today's environment would be considered somewhat progressive or liberal, right? But we see him as this sort of, conservative or / purely Republican figure. Eisenhower, the same thing. So republicanism and conservatism have kind of been interwoven in the 80s model, right, where Reagan made these deals with the religious right, for example, welcoming them in, putting pro-life plank in our platform for the first time. So we have this cultural component. But you then also have these sort of economic arguments as well. I tend to think that what Trump has done is expose the true nature of the Republican Party. And as someone who's led it, I can speak that there's a lot of truth to that for me. Because there are meetings and conversations I've had where I sat in the room and go, oh shit, this is okay, this is different. This is what these people really think about some of this stuff. How do you see it? Is this aberrational behavior from Republicans, or is it more in line across the board, not just on something like tariffs, but on the culture issues, on the politics, on certainly how we see our relationship with our allies? How do you see it?
I guess the way that I would tell the story, and it's funny, I think it's actually very important to distinguish Republican Party from conservatism in this respect, because I think, the fascinating thing about Reagan is that he brought together a particular coalition to be the Republican Party.
Yes.
And the political scientists, they call what he put together, they call it fusionism, which was bringing together the sort of social conservatives, what I would say is kind of core of the conservative movement, with the very free market libertarian economists, and with the Cold War hawks.
Boom.
And that's the famous, it's called the three-legged stool of Reagan republicanism. And that coalition had some things they really agreed on. And the most important was they all really agreed on the horrors of communism and the need to defeat it and win the Cold War.
Right.
And
so on that point, I don't want to take you off your thought there, but on that point, I think it's important. That idea of fighting communism became the animating thing, and everything else kind of took a back seat to that and slid into areas and zones that people weren't paying attention to and weren't that concerned about at the moment, because they had that North Star of anti-communism. Am
That's
I
right. And
correct?
that's exactly right. And so it's also a settlement where each group essentially gets some of what it wants and accepts that others get what they want. And so it's very interesting. It doesn't take very long to realize all the ways these groups didn't agree. I mean, the sort of the aggressive Cold War hawk foreign policy wasn't conservative by any, I would say, natural definition of conservatism. Certainly the sort of radical free market approach was not conservative in a lot of cases. If you think about even just the way that markets are not always very friendly to families and communities and so
Right.
forth. Certainly the free market folks didn't agree about all sorts of things with the foreign policy folks, but each were sort of given their domain in which to prosecute the case against communism. And we should say that was tremendously successful, both as a political coalition and as a substantive matter. It won the Cold War. So we should be very thankful for it. But once the Cold War was over, it seems to me the logic of that coalition disappeared to some extent. And what you start to see, and this is why I say so much of what I think it went wrong after the Cold War. You start to have Cold War hawks who no longer have a Cold War to fight,
Right.
kind of just go off and look for other wars to start instead, right?
Culture war, economic war. Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
I mean specifically on the foreign policy side, like go find other countries to invade.
There you go. Okay.
And the economic folks, it's really only in the 1990s that they start to develop this absurdly over-aggressive approach to free trade. Why not free trade with China and so forth?
Right.
That's when the sort of thou shalt never raise taxes pledges show up, right? Reagan raised taxes 5 times when his first tax cut raised less revenue than he expected. And so you sort of get these groups within the coalition becoming more extreme in various ways. And that sort of reached a breaking point. And I think Trump represents sort of the thing that emerges at the point where that coalition is breaking. And I think what you see now being assembled is a new coalition that still has that conservatism at its heart in terms of social conservatism, kind of basic conservative orientation, but is adding different economic and foreign policy views to it.
Right.
And that's where I think, Vice President Vance's speech at the RNC convention was so fascinating on this point, because the rhetoric that he kept returning to was pairing this idea of sort of, they sent our jobs overseas and then they sent our young men overseas. And I mean, it's sort of a nice rhetorical flourish. In some senses, you would say, like, well, wait a minute, what are those two things don't actually have anything to do with each other, though.
Right.
But actually they do. What he's doing is he's simultaneously, from the square ground of the conservatives, criticizing both what the economic folks were doing with the offshoring and globalization, and what the foreign policy folks were doing with an overambitious foreign policy, and saying both of those were unsuccessful projects. Neither of them is something that we want as a part of the Republican coalition anymore. And you have a lot of other folks coming into the coalition. And you see, certainly, in terms of supporters of Trump's, a lot more working class folks, multi-ethnic, across racial groups. You see certainly a lot more engagement from the labor movement. You see things like the kind of the MAGA trend, and how that fits in is an interesting question. And so what you're seeing now is the question of, okay, what is the new coalition? What is the sort of animating principle? And ultimately then also who will get to decide what, because there will be compromises among those groups as well. But that idea we had in our head of Reagan's 3-legged stool as what a Republican is, that was at a point in time, and no one should ever have expected that to hold permanently. And I think clearly it no longer does.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. Surprisingly, I thought somewhere in there I would go a little sideways with you. I think that analysis is exactly right, which kind of begs for me the question: what is the new conservative then? What is that? Who is that person? Maybe I'm stuck at a time and place as a Republican that I've watched this party kind of go by me like this, and I'm just kind of looking and say, right? Oh, that's fair. I'm good with that because I'm anchored in a certain value system in which I still value my allies more than my enemies. And so I'm not going to play with Putin. I'm just not. Maybe I'm a creature of Reagan and the evil empire and shiny city on the hill and all of that. And I am, because that's when I came into this as a young man at 17. And so for me, those things still matter. Also, though, having served within the infrastructure and have been in the space, Oren, where you see and hear a lot of what you're talking about, then very quietly in corners, now very prominently on the front porch, right? Stuff that was in the back room of the house is now on the front porch of the house. And so my question is, what does the house look like? What's inside that house now? And you really kind of raise that up with this question of, all right, what is the new conservatism? So this anthology that you're putting together is about restoring America's commitment to family, community, and industry. What does that look like? What are we restoring? Because what I would think you're restoring doesn't sound like what I think you're saying is going to be restored. And that's where I'm curious, what does that mean for someone in my seat right now? Number one, I'm going to ask you a two-parter, and I apologize, but I'm just flow of conscious, and I've only got you for so much time. What would a Mitt Romney presidency actually have looked like relative to what we see from Trump? Because in my view, Mitt Romney was the last of that vestige of Republicanism before we got this. And so I'm really curious if that would have just been a prolongation of something that was eventually going to collapse into what this new conservatism is, or would it have changed what that new conservatism looks like with maybe elements and components of some of what we see from Trump or not? I don't know.
Yeah,
You're the great thinker on this.
The Romney question is an interesting one. I mean, Romney was very clearly a three-legged stool Republican. I remember he would just explicitly talk about it in those terms, and I think rightly argued that he was a very good representative of that. There were some areas where I think he had very important divergences. I mentioned on China as an example. He was really willing to throw a lot of the orthodoxy out the window. But I think you're right in general that he probably represented the sort of the history's last man of that version of the Republican Party.
Right.
And I always tell people as an example, the opioid crisis by 2012 was already a massive national crisis, had been for a decade. It wasn't really something that was on our radar. I mean, it was something that, questions would come in from the field. And I'll be the first to admit, I didn't appreciate the kind of challenges that folks were facing in that regard. I think actually a lot of really good research came out on deaths of despair. David Otter's research on the China shock and what had really happened as a result of free trade. All of that comes out between 2012 and 2016. And so I think there's a way in which, problems that the seeds of which were really planted around the year 2000 were sprouting and growing and inevitably going to, pick your metaphor, crack the pavement. And so I think definitely things had to change. The interesting thing, and I guess I'm actually very curious about your thoughts on this, is it's absolutely the case that as parties and coalitions shift, people end up moving between parties. I mean, you go back and you see there were the Reagan Democrats, and before that, obviously in the 60s, the parties switched on all sorts of issues.
Right.
And so it is not uncommon. You have periods of sort of stasis and trench warfare between two coalitions, and then things shift and people cross borders. I guess I'm curious, what would you have defined as the key elements of Republican that made you a Republican? Because I mean, you mentioned the I think you're probably being unfair to the Trump administration on its posture toward Russia. I would describe what the administration is doing now as just an extremely realist perspective. And it seems to me that that's not all that different from the Reagan perspective. Reagan was working within the confines of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union is the evil empire. But to the extent that we needed to ally or side with very unsavory forces, if it helped us advance that goal in the Cold War, Reagan certainly never shrank away from doing that. I would say he was quite realist. The sort of extremely ideological form of Republican foreign policy was really a feature of kind of the George W. Bush era party more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, what would be the sort of three things that you would say, defined, well, this is what it means to be a Republican, and now feels like they're not present anymore?
And first and foremost, why I joined the party, my study of the history of the party relative to the Democrats. My mother told me as a young kid when I was in 1976 first presidential election, my mother says, don't be a Democrat because I'm a Democrat. Your daddy's a Democrat. You live in a Democratic city. Go out and discover for yourself who you are, what you believe. That's your orientation. That's your North Star. And I did. And I understood the history of my party as one that was founded first and foremost on the individual rights and liberties of everyone under our Constitution, regardless of the color of their skin, which is why we broke from the Whigs in the first place, because we couldn't countenance the idea that we would. And it was a struggle. And I appreciate that honest struggle of Abraham Lincoln, caught between wanting to appease those who were pro-slavery to keep the Union together, at the same time recognizing that that was antithetical to what the words on the document said. And so I appreciate that struggle, and I appreciate the party that struggled with that. And then coming out and saying that I, as a Black man, am as valued and as important to this country as the white man. That was the first thing that really struck me. And then to go on and to memorialize it in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And we know the history and the consternation around all of that. And then to come out and say, okay, in a post-slavery era, we're going to memorialize it further by putting in place the economic mooring, 40 acres and a mule, first affirmative action program that will help anchor and reestablish your role and presence. But then to know that that didn't just apply to me, but it applied to others who came to this shore, as a party that supported immigration, for example, party that supported protecting the environment, Teddy Roosevelt. Again, affirmative action. Richard Nixon gave us affirmative action, right? So we bitch about affirmative action, but it was us who created it because we recognize the importance of the individual journey towards the American dream, and that there can be obstacles along the way. So that, for me, is the first and most important thing of what it is to be a Republican, is that you recognize the value of everyone in this country, no matter how they got here, no matter their story, being able to realize for themselves the power of the American dream and the individual rights that come from being protected by our Constitution. The second thing that's important for me is recognizing that there is a valuable role for government, state, local, federal. And having been a statewide elected official, I came to appreciate this more than anything else, that there is a role, but it is a limited role. So the idea of a limited government is not just two words put together, but in that is neither a move towards a anti-government, right? We hate the federal government. I would always cringe when Reagan say, hey, the worst words you can hear is, I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help. Great laugh line, but I think it did a disservice to what government is there for ultimately. And I get the politics of saying it and why it works that way as a catchphrase. But it does undermine exactly what Republicans, I thought, saw the utilization of government to make government work for citizens. We don't want to raise taxes. We all have the argument, Democrats want to, let's pay more for this program. Okay, well, is the program working? Because if the program's not working, why are we putting more money into it, right? So I get this notion out of Trump world about, waste, fraud, and abuse, tackling that. Okay, fine, but that's not what you're doing, because you're not examining whether or not these programs are functionally important for the work that needs to be done, whether it's a STEM program or whether it's a food program or whether it's a cultural program, right? So making sure government does what it's supposed to do in its limited capacity, then get the hell out of the way, which gets to the third part, the free markets. That's where my dream rests. I may have entrepreneurial, inspirations. Let me follow that. Let me explore that, and let the government not stand in the way of that. So regulation and all of that stuff. Yeah, I want clean water. I want clean air. Let's regulate it, but don't regulate it to the point where I can't breathe or swallow, right? So for me, these three things really do matter, anchored first and foremost by the fact that I'm free to access the other two. And I do so with a limited government not standing in my way. And I do so with the American dream squarely in front of me. I want our party to talk about that. I don't want to deal in the bullshit we're doing right now, because it's antithetical to everything that drew me in. And so I don't want to play to your grievance. I don't want to make you more pissed off so I can raise another dollar from you. I don't want to make you angry at the Black neighbor or the Hispanic neighbor or the white neighbor, because I'm going to gain likes and tweets from it. And that part of the party, what we've sunk into, is what pisses me off. Now, I call myself, additionally, Oren, a Motel 6 Republican. Why? Because I believe someone's got to keep the lights on for the things I just described, and for the things I think you fundamentally articulate as well. And so I'm always putting a new light bulb in, because these bastards keep shooting it out with another level of bullshit crazy. All right, another bulb, put it in, because I want the light to stay on. I recognize Ronald Reagan, in his imagery created about this country as a shining city on a hill. The rest of that story is you and me, Oren, my Democratic neighbors, the individual who just came to the country, however, legally or illegally. Why did they do that? Why do we do what we do? Because we are the light in that city. And we need, as a party, we once talked about the country in those terms, right? The last great effort under the Bush administration to do something on immigration, conservatives killed it. The last great effort to do something about immigration, after we bitched all day, all for 4 years about it, right? Conservatives under Trump killed it. So every time we have a chance to make the light brighter, we shoot the bulb out. And that frustration, that tension for me, is why I stand where I stand in opposition to what this party in its current iteration is doing. But I stay. I get it all the time, man. Why are you still Republican? Because of the things I just said. Why won't you leave? Because I don't believe in what the other side is doing. I don't philosophically align with Democrats. I'm pro-life, right? And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I want clarity. Right. But I'm also against the death penalty, because I'm a Catholic Christian. And guess what? Life is life, regardless of whether it's in the womb or a jail cell. So these things, for me, are animated by the philosophical thread of a Republicanism, flawed and fraught as it was, that inspired a 17-year-old Black kid growing up in D.C. to join the party. And it started with a man named Lincoln, who had a friend named Frederick Douglass, that helped shape the party that stood about individual rights, liberties, and freedoms. Because without those three things, I don't care what your tax bracket is. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not we like Putin or play with stormer in Great Britain. So that's kind of where my head is, and which is why I appreciated your engagement with Jon Stewart, because at various times in your conversation, I heard me. I felt my brand of republicanism. This is a thread, it's like, okay, yes, this is what it's about. This is why we say and do what we do. And a lot of my resistance to Trumpism and MAGAism, because I think it is not genuine. It's performative. It's reactive. It's theater. And I don't appreciate that. And then the ugly underbelly of it, when you're getting into nationalism, white Christo nationalism, is bullshit I don't want to play with, because it's antithetical to what I believe the country should be about. But that's the debate within our party. Some have left. Others stay because they're crazy like me. Others stay because they're trying to offer up a philosophy and an understanding, and that you present. And so we see all these things kind of playing out, man. And it's exciting on one hand, it's frustrating as hell on another. And but I believe I can still have more say inside my tent than going outside and being mad at it. And that to me is not what Republicans should do.
That's very interesting. Well, I know we're running out of time. I want to make two quick points about.
Sure.
About
I'd love to hear your feedback about that.
Well, so
I went off on a soliloquy. You open the door, baby. I'm living with this every day. So
no, it's super interesting. And the two things I would say about it: one, your description about the things that you valued in the Republican Party and are most important to you, were all about process. They were all about the means. None of them actually spoke to what substantive ends or outcomes you want to see for people. And I think that's a huge, huge problem with the way that the Republican Party had been operating, because it really allows you to avoid a lot of the trade-offs that other people struggle with. So I could take everything you just said and say, well, that's great. That's why we should embrace free trade with China, right? It is optimistic and forward-looking, and it's takes a welcome global view rather than a nationalist one, and it's going to provide a lot of opportunity. It's going to uplift maybe hundreds of millions of people around the world. It's going to mean more consumption. You didn't actually give me anything to grab onto that would acknowledge that there was anything wrong with the path that the Republican Party was on. And so I think a real important.
Okay. Don't get that twisted. I mean, I get all the time, when I start to apply what I just described to you, to everyday life, and this is where coming actually, because a lot of people flap their lips because they're in offices where they don't have to take responsibility for shit. Congressmen don't take responsibility for shit. Senators don't take responsibility for anything. Governors do. Go talk to Republican governors and lieutenant governors. Go talk to Republican county executives. When you're on the ground, go talk to Republican mayors. That's where the application of what you believe confronts the reality of someone's condition and situation. No, I didn't give you all of that. Now, if you want to pull back that onion, that's a whole nother show, because then I'm going to confuse the hell out of you, because there are going to be some things where I'm going to go, the Democrats got that shit right. Right? And we need to acknowledge that and not get stuck on that stupid pretending that we can't move towards working with unions. And I was really happy to hear you say that earlier, because that's not process, that's reality. Workers matter. And if they need to be, I grew up in a household where my mother said to me that one of the worst things she ever decided to do was not join the union when it was offered at the laundry in which she worked. And she went through that process, and I went through that process with her, and I began to appreciate why she suddenly valued what that would have meant to her and her family as she sat there retiring on minimum wage and trying to put me through Catholic grade school and high school and Johns Hopkins University. making minimum wage, as opposed to what could have been had her laundry embraced a union that would have fought more for her worker rights so she could better feed and educate her family. So I get those storylines. I just gave you top line shit. We want to get down into it. The application is where you take that philosophy of a limited government. Okay, now it's going to confront the reality, as I did as a lieutenant governor, when a young woman said, hey, I'm about to lose my home, trying to do a program to improve myself because I can't pay my rent, because when I come to this class, my employer docks my pay because I'm not there. And so therefore my paycheck is short and I can't pay my rent. Okay, now I had to deal with that, and I did. And I put government to work on her behalf. A lot of my Republican friends would have go, well, then she needs to go find something else to do. And so when we lose sight of that connective between what I described as those three philosophical things, dealing with the practical reality of life, that's where I think we kind of have veered off. And so I don't want to leave you with the impression that it's all process for me. It isn't, because I had to run a government. I had to balance budgets. I had to do all the things that I wanted to do, that I was asked to do by the governor and by the people when I was in office, and having to confront every day the real life example that people lived out. And so, yeah, I can wax poetically about, free trade markets and all this other stuff. But shit, at the end of the day, someone's got to put food on their table. And if my party stands in the way of that, then that's a problem, when we don't acknowledge that they have to put food on their table because we're stuck on this idea that everyone should pull themselves up by their bootstrap. So I said to Jack Kemp, last point, one of the last things I did together with Jack Kemp before his death was a house party in Bethesda, Maryland. And Jack Kemp being Jack Kemp, such an incredible guy. You know his thing about a rising tide lifts all boats, right? But you know where my Republicanism had led me by that point as a young man? I remember saying to Jack as we're walking out of the house, I said, man, I really appreciate that, but it caused me to think about one thing. What do you do if you don't have a boat? I said, we can't be just about telling people that a rising tide is going to lift all boats. Pull yourself up by the bootstrap. Well, I got boots. We need to help create the means for people to access the dream. So when that rising tide comes in, they don't drown. They're not forgotten. And as a party, we don't talk about that part of it, right? We think DEI is somehow a crime. You mean the diversity of your Irish ancestors wasn't important? You mean the equity afforded your German cousins when they came to these shores wasn't important? You mean being included as an Italian back at the turn of the century wasn't important? So don't redefine DEI because it now touches Black and brown people, and it is something that comes out of the Black experience in this country as something negative. That to me is bullshit. And that's not Republicanism, because Republicanism recognizes everybody's dream, however they define it. And DEI is not a government program. It is asking governments and institutions to recognize that they're Black and brown people who can be disserved. And yes, the racism is still real because banks still redline communities. And if we can't acknowledge that as a party, that's not process. We can't acknowledge that as a party, we fail as a party. And it's not conservative to say, oh, that's, we don't do that and we're going to criminalize it. That's just un-American for me, because that's not what we do. All right. If we can't tell the story of Black and brown people, come on. Then we're stripping out the lunch counter out of the Black American Museum. Why? We don't want people to see the lunch counter that Black individuals risked their lives to sit at to make the country own what was written in the Constitution. Come on, stop it. Why are we doing
that? Look, that's a very interesting interpretation of the DEI issue in the country.
That interpretation is what they're telling us.
Well,
that interpretation, you're telling me what it is.
It's just very funny to hear you say something like DEI is not a government program when when obviously a huge problem is the extent to which the government did make it a government program. But I do want to make just the one final point,
Sure.
which is I think you know the the point you made about what attracted you to the party, I think is really interesting. What is striking to me about the Trump approach, including what he says about DEI and so forth, is literally how many times more 17-year-old Black men are attracted to it than are attracted to the version that attracted you. And I'm very curious what you make of that.
Look, I'm playing to your machismo. Look, I can tell you what that is. I mean, it's a whole lot of things. I'm playing, I'm offering up gold lame tennis shoes because you think that young Black men are into sneakers. I'm playing up, we're gonna protect your right to smoke menthol cigarettes. Like that's a thing. I mean, the stereotyping and the sort of.
I'm sorry, just to jump in, that's not the Trump pitch. In fact, Kamala Harris
was very much the Trump pitch.
No, Kamala Harris put out a 5-point agenda opportunity agenda for young Black men, of which one of the 5 items was Bitcoin and one of the 5 items was marijuana legalization. So yeah, I've seen what that looks like, and that's not what the Trump appeal was.
But that's because you know what the marijuana piece was? Because Black entrepreneurs, the young Black men who went to jail because of marijuana laws, now have the opportunity to benefit from actually being entrepreneurial in that space. That's what that was about. It wasn't playing that Black people like to smoke marijuana. It's like, guess what? The thing that you went to jail for, you now can begin to build a dream around because white kids are already doing it. That's what that was about. So, this idea that you sort of stereotype your approach to the Black community. So let me tell you this. Oh, you're going to now you're going to criminalize DEI across the federal government. Can't talk about it, can't do anything, say anything. Oh, but you're going to host a DEI program, a Black History Month program at the White House. Really? I'm really, it says stupid across my forehead. So the reality of it is, don't play me. Don't come at me and thinking that you're just going to level up and show me a statistic that young Black men are coming into the Republican Party. What's anchoring them? What's the sell here? I don't understand what it is. I haven't heard it. I mean, when I was national chairman, I came into my community and got criticized for it. The first town hall I did was in Harlem, and you thought I was asking the party to go to the moon. And I did a town hall at Howard University on healthcare, not on tennis shoes, right? So this is my point. It's like, talk to me about the substance of my life and what I'm trying to do. You say I'm entrepreneurial because I am. Then don't just throw up this crazy stuff that you think appeals to me because it's got bling attached to it, Bitcoin, all that. Talk about markets I can right now access. Right? Talk about things I can right now do. And that's all my push is. So yeah, I get the numbers have moved, but you need to dig down into what those numbers are actually telling you. These folks aren't philosophically anchoring themselves to this party because there's no philosophy here. That's not the thing that drew me in, right? As a young 17-year-old kid. I'm not like, you show me the bling in the right. Oh yeah, I can do Bitcoin. Oh, great. All right, wait till you try to do it. You don't have the education to do it because you're in a failing school system that no one's addressing. And so oh, by the way, and they just took away the program that you need if you think you're going to make those steps because there is no more, program for this, that, or other things that were there infrastructurally to help you. So it's just about how we find the balance, I think, Oren. You and I, man, could go on for days. I want to let you get back to your thing. I appreciate you, and I want us to continue a conversation because I love your voice. I'm really looking forward to the New Conservatives when it comes out. I just appreciate you and the way you, at least for me, stimulated thinking and conversation, which is why I wanted to have you on. I am a Republican who is conservative in a number of spaces, would be considered moderate in some others, I guess. I've never sort of relied on that part of who I am as much as I've relied on being a Republican and what that means. And so for Republicans like me, the curiosity going forward is, what exactly does that mean? Which is why I wanted to talk to you.
No, this was awesome. Really appreciate you having me on, and we will have to keep talking.
No, I really would like that. And I'd like to actually talk to you some more offline too, with your permission. So I think that would be a lot of fun. Oren Cass, one of the best podcasts I've done this year. You made it, for me, this was really cathartic and helpful. The new work coming out June 3rd, The New Conservatives, Restoring America's Commitment to Family, Community, and Industry. Folks, get a copy of it and take that journey that Oren is going to lay out in that work. I really appreciate you, man, and taking the time to come on.
Thank you very much. We'll talk again soon.
All right, folks, that does it for our time together right now. As always, I love it when you join us on the playground and keep doing what you're doing. Love the work and support you're giving us here on the Bulwark platform. Stay tuned. There's more good stuff coming right here on the Michael Steele podcast. And remember what I always tell you, don't play with stupid, because you wind up doing stupid things. Stay away from it. Until next time, take care.